Okay, so I'm not sure exactly how clued into current sports you are, and I'm certainly not an expert by any means, but I do know a football player, a particular football player named Aaron Ross, and he's a cornerback right now for the New York Giants, so he's a football player. And this is my attempt to draw football, but he's a football player, and with the New York Giants, so far, I believe he's won 2 Super Bowls, so suffice it to say, he's a pretty good football player. And I know another athlete, and her name is Sonia Richards Ross, and I'm sure you can guess that they're married. And Sonia Richards Ross is a track and field kind of phenom. She's really good. She is a gold medal winner in the 4x400 in 2004 in Athens, and then 2008 in Beijing, and also in 2012 in London. So suffice it to say, after winning 3 gold medals in the 4x400, she's a very good athlete as well. And so this is my attempt to draw her gold medals, which I'm sure she has almost an endless supply of. But I bring them up, and I bring this ultra athletic couple up to kind of posit a question for us. Do you suppose if Aaron Ross and Sonia Richards Ross had a child, that their child would be a athletic phenom as well? And if so, would you say that it was because they have this incredible genetic makeup, these incredibly athletic genes, or because they were raised in this environment, this household that really emphasized sports and emphasized athleticism, and that's what their parents cared about, so that's what they were instilled with? Would they be an athlete, and if so, why? Would it be because of their genes or because of their environment? And it turns out this is the type of question that a famous scientist named Sir Francis Galton was asking himself 100 or so years ago, and he happens to be the cousin of a man, maybe more famous, named Charles Darwin. And after his cousin published the book The Origin of Species and started looking at the ideas of heredity and natural selection, Sir Francis Galton took that idea and he kind of pulled it into an area of research that he was interested in. And so he started looking at the degree to which human ability is hereditary. And so he actually ended up coining the famous phrase of nature versus nurture. That was kind of his phrase. And so he, turns out, was a big innovator of the field of behavior genetics. And I'll write that down. And behavior genetics is going to kind of be what this entire video series is about. But to start talking about behavior genetics, we really need to start with genes. And so that is why I have this DNA and this chromosome out, and we're going to work our way through that. A lot of the interest around behavior genetics and the involvement of genes kind of centers really on the idea of the central dogma of molecular genetics, which essentially kind of says that all living things have genetic material. All living things. So bacteria have genetic material, and humans have genetic material, and plants have genetic material, but all of them have genetic material, and that genetic material is transcribed and translated into proteins, and that these proteins really form the backbone of who we are and how we respond to our environment. So without further ado, I feel like we should probably start with the genetic material. And I've drawn that here, and what I've drawn is DNA. And DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, and it happens to be the genetic material of most things in the living world, but especially us humans. And that's really what behavior genetics centers on, so we'll stay with humans. But DNA is essentially a long chain of genetic information, and so this is DNA, and there are the bases that come together. We've got the A and the T and the G and the C, and I don't want to go too deep there, or we'll get lost in molecules, and we want to stay in psychology. But we've got DNA, and a chain essentially of many bases of DNA form what we call genes. And so I'll write genes here. So we have these links of DNA kind of segmented into genes, and after they're all coiled up, and you can kind of see this DNA chain coiling, and it coils ever so tightly, and eventually it forms a chromosome. So I'll write that in as well. And so with all of the different species composed of this genetic material, we find that the number of chromosomes vary quite frequently. But in humans, every cell contains this genetic material in it. And so every cell then contains chromosomes, and every cell, except for the couple of cells meant for replication, contain 46 chromosomes. And I'll write that number because it's sort of important. And what that number represents is really two sets of 23 chromosomes. And so what happens is we get half of these chromosomes from our father and half of them from our mother. And let me kind of draw some pictures that represent this idea. Here we have our father contributing his 23 chromosomes, and then one more picture. And we'll say this is our mother contributing her 23 chromosomes. But that's what you have. We have 46 chromosomes, really 23 pairs of chromosomes. In each one of these chromosomes, we have 23 coding for kind of a complete set of genes, and then another 23 coding for those same genes. And so we kind of have two different options for these genes, and one ends up getting expressed and one ends up not getting expressed. And there are a couple kind of exceptions to that as we get into the sex chromosomes and the Y and the X. But really, at a kind of bird's eye view, all of these chromosomes are in every one of these cells, and every one of the cells has this genetic material. And so in humans, that breaks down to roughly, I believe, 30 or so thousand genes. So there are 30 or so thousand genes in our genetic library. And all those genes, as I said before, code for these proteins and really ultimately make us who we are. They code for the traits, and they also code for these proteins that are going to allow us to adapt to our environment. So they code for who we are and kind of give us that ability to adapt to our environment. And really, this is fairly cutting edge stuff. It was, within this past century that a couple famous scientists, James Watson and Francis Crick, gave us the molecular model for DNA. So we've only discovered this in the past 100 or so years, and then really in the past decade or so is when our genomic library, the human genome, which is composed of all these genes, was completely mapped, and we learned which genes control which traits and which proteins. And so this is essentially very cutting edge, and it's extremely fascinating. And what we're finding out is that functionally, as we map our genomic library and the genomic library of other species, is that we are 99.4 or so percent similar to chimps in terms of functional genetic content. So let me write that down. And that's my chimp. Maybe I'll give him a banana just because we have time. So that's my chimp. We're 99.4% genetically similar to chimpanzees, and then even more impressive, at least to me, we're 99.9% genetically similar to all of our other humans in our species. So let me write that number down as well, because I think it's important. And so this is my human, and I'm at least 99.9% similar to her. And I write this down, and I wrote down the chimpanzee information. I wrote down that we have 30 or so thousand genes, and I drew this picture, and I said it's all important because as we learn more about our genetic makeup, and as we learn about our similarities to other species, and especially our similarities to each other, behavior geneticists begin to ask, as we get this information, what is this information, this kind of map of our genome, what information is that telling us about what our personalities will be like when we grow up, or what our abilities will be like? And that takes us back to this initial question over here that I kind of posed for us at the beginning. will this child of these two superstar athletes be an athletic phenom because of this genetic makeup, or if not, how did the environment influence that? Because ultimately, in him at birth, in every one of his cells, was the code for everything that makes him who he is, and everything that gives him or her the ability to respond to their environment. And so what we're going to see in the field of behavior genetics is an attempt to tease apart kind of the influence of genes and the influence of environment, and to see how much of which is contributing to certain areas of our lives. And it becomes quite fascinating. And so in the next video, I'm going to begin to talk about the experimental methods that behavior geneticists use to kind of tease apart this idea of nature and this idea of nurture.